But John, I mean, on the question of Syria, I mean, for a long time, for the past year and a half, we've been following and reading and seeing. And people have been saying Israel, I mean, obviously Israel has been doing an enormous amount of damage in terms of the bombing of civilians, the killing of Palestinians, the killing of Lebanese, just massacres and genocide and so on and so forth. But the sense was that Israel wasn't, quote, winning politically. After Syria, after the collapse of the regime in Syria, is it fair to say now that in a sense the axis of resistance is essentially over, and that Israel and behind it the United States have won because when push came to shove, the U.S.-Israeli alliance, or whatever you want to call it, the Israeli, whatever the relationship is, they put everything in, and the axis of resistance didn't. They hesitated, and in the end, they were defeated. So, from a realist perspective, can't one say that what's happening now is that Israel has basically won in Syria, has contained Hezbollah, has essentially ethnically cleansed the Palestinians from North Gaza. So they've come out on top because they have unlimited U.S. aid and support, despite the genocide, or irrespective of the genocide. So how do you read the situation in Syria and the unfolding of the situation of Syria from a realist perspective?
Well, let me just make a couple points about Israel. I fully understand that the rhetoric today is that Israel has won this great victory, especially because of Syria, and it's transforming the region. But I would note to you that Israel's goal in Gaza was to decisively defeat Hamas. It has not decisively defeated Hamas. It has not come close. Its goal in Lebanon was to decisively defeat Hezbollah. It has not decisively defeated Hezbollah. In fact, there were many Israelis who were deeply upset about the fact that you had a ceasefire because they thought that Israel needed to finish the job against Hezbollah. So Hamas and Hezbollah are still alive and pack a lot of punch. The Houthis are still there. And with regard to Iran, yes, Iran has suffered a defeat in Syria, but Iran is still there. It's not going away. It's not going to roll over and play dead. And if you look at the extent to which it's enriching uranium, it's on the threshold of becoming a nuclear weapons state. And as far as Israel is concerned, that is an existential threat. That is the greatest threat that Israel could possibly face in the near future. And again, Israel is facing an Iran that is on the threshold of becoming a nuclear weapons state. So it doesn't look all that good from Israel's point of view once you get away from all the spinning that we hear in the United States. And with regard to Syria, Syria was never a serious threat to Israel. Was Syria part of the axis of resistance? I guess it was. And I think Syria mattered, in my opinion, because it was a conduit through which Iran sent weaponry to Hezbollah. And I think the fact that Syria at this point in time is no longer a conduit for Iranian weaponry going into southern Lebanon is a victory for Israel and matters. But other than that, I don't see what's going on in Syria as a great victory for Israel. So I just don't have this view that the Middle East has been transformed in a way that favors Israel in profound ways. What happened on October 7th is now all in the rear view mirror. It's all over with. It just doesn't matter anymore. We've turned the tide. Israel's now in an ideal situation. I don't think that's true at all. Again, Hezbollah's there. Hamas is there. The Houthis are there. Israel is being prosecuted for genocide in the International Court of Justice. Arrest warrants have been issued by the ICC for Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel's reputation around the world is in tatters. All sorts of people, even in the West, understand that this notion of Israel as a David up against a Goliath is a myth that bears zero resemblance to reality. So I don't think Israel is in all that good shape. And finally, you want to understand that there are powerful centrifugal forces inside of Israel that were threatening to tear the country apart before October 7th. There were countless articles in the Israeli media about a potential civil war in Israel before October 7th. Those centrifugal forces, in my opinion, will be even stronger moving forward, mainly because of demographics related to birth rates among the ultra-Orthodox, right? So this is a country that has big problems at home. It's become more dependent on the United States than ever, which is not in its interest. And in terms of the constellation of adversaries that it faces out there, it doesn't look like such a promising position to be in from my point of view.
No, I agree. I mean, I agree with you. I agree with everything you said, John. I wasn't advocating the opposite. I was just asking. These are questions that get asked, and this is what people often hear on in terms of the interpretation. But in terms of deterrence, I mean, you could also flip it from the other side and say that Hezbollah, for example, had said that they had established deterrence with Israel. That if Beirut is bombed, Tel Aviv would be bombed. And what happened at the end is that the ceasefire that's occurred has occurred where the Israelis are violating the ceasefire every single day, and they're establishing they're trying to. Let's see what happens. This new paradigm which says that they can bomb wherever they want, whomever they want, and they can invade Syria and nobody can stop them. And I'm just trying to figure out, when people look at this, the Axis has also taken a hit. It's not just that Israel has not accomplished its goals. The Axis of resistance was unable to stop the genocide. Yeah, sorry. Just I'm just trying to figure out, if we flip it the other way too, let's get a realist reading of the axis of resistance. I agree with everything John said. I'm just saying, let's look at the other side.
I agree with what he said too. But on the other hand, you could say 5 or 6 Israeli army divisions didn't make more than 1,000 or 2,000 meters into Lebanon after 2 months of incredible fighting, right? Or Hamas in Gaza today is still destroying Israeli tanks and knocking out Israeli infantry. So my question for John is, in view of the fact that the Israelis were, I mean, you're the political theorist. I'm just a literary critic, but it seems to me that one cannot talk about a military victory when the enemy is still on the field and still basically facing you down. That doesn't, to me, constitute a victory. But then, if Israel has not won in Gaza or in southern Lebanon, and I don't think it has, I think it's been defeated militarily in both places, it is still transacting a genocide in Gaza. So how do we balance this ability to inflict massive harm, most obviously on the people in Gaza or in southern Lebanon, without attaining a victory over its ostensible opponents, Hamas and Hezbollah respectively, while also, to recap what you said, John, while also suffering itself. I mean, its long-term loss of face in the West, its long-term loss of standing in the West, that will hurt it in the long run. There's no question about that. Its own internal crises that have deepened, and its economic crisis, the fact that these wars are incredibly expensive, drained its army, which is basically a conscript army that can't fight on all these fronts for months and months and months on end. So how do we balance it in the end? I guess one question is, what do we do with this balance between its inability to achieve what I would understand military victory to be, but of course you can correct me on that, with, on the other hand, its ability to inflict massive harm, the killing of probably 200,000 Palestinians in Gaza, the destruction of every house, school, hospital, university, and so on. How do we, when you're assessing these, how do you balance these things in your terms, if that makes sense?
Well, I'm not sure how you can balance them in any precise way. I mean, there's sort of two sides to the story. And there's no question that the Israelis have won in certain respects, right? There's no question that getting rid of Assad and cutting off the conduit in southern Syria is a win for Israel. There's no question that getting a ceasefire with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon was, in a certain sense, a win for Israel. But the point is that Israel has a whole set of problems that it wants to solve, that wants to put an end to these problems. If you go back to the whole question of how to deal with the Palestinians, and you talk about the iron wall, Zeev Jabotinsky's notion of an iron wall, the idea was that you could eventually beat the Palestinians into a submission, that there was an end game here. The problem the Israelis face is there's no end game. They may win tactical victories along the way. They may capture more territory. The borders of Greater Israel will obviously expand as a result of this war. Not tremendously, but somewhat. But the problems that they face have not gone away. The Palestinians are still there, Hezbollah is still there, and so forth and so on. And what this tells you, or at least tells me, is that you cannot solve these problems with military force. The Israelis and their American allies, this gets back to our early discussion, that it's hard to just talk about the Israelis, because this victory, by the way, is due in large part to the Americans, not the Israelis. Let's just go to Syria for a second. It's not the Israelis who are principally responsible for toppling Assad. I believe the Israelis played a minor role in that. It's the Turks and the Americans who played the key roles in toppling Assad. Of course, the United States was basically doing Israel's bidding, but it was not Israel itself. But you have this situation where Israel relies on the big stick. It's big stick diplomacy. It's the iron wall, in effect. It's Jabotinsky's way of dealing with Arabs, right? The idea is you just beat the hell out of them and they're eventually going to submit. But that doesn't work. There has to be a political solution to these problems. This is why every president since Jimmy Carter pushed hard for a two-state solution, because those American presidents understood we needed a political solution, and the two-state solution was the best idea we could come up with. Well, that didn't work. The Israelis are not interested in political solutions. The Israelis are interested in using the big stick. And that big stick is basically an American big stick or an American supplied big stick. And they think that they can beat the hell out of people forever and ever and get away with it. And that this is going to have a happy ending at some point. I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that. I think the Israelis are in real trouble. And these so-called victories now are tactical victories.
Yeah, I would concur with that completely. But we're almost done now. Just to wrap up, in a way, to come back to the lobby and the domestic scene here in the U.S. I mean, insofar as the Israeli so-called big stick is in fact an American supplied, financed, enabled, etc. big stick, obviously it means, as you were saying at the beginning of this conversation, the Israelis depend ever more on the U.S. to the point of this is an absolute. They'd be paralyzed without U.S. support. Therefore, the work of the lobby is all the more important to sustain this enterprise, right? I would say, I think that clearly, as you've said, the lobby is very, very strong. But on the other hand, if we look at our campuses, I know I've been following the news a little bit from Chicago, here at UCLA, at other campuses across the country, and in some of the opinion polls, especially of young people in the U.S., it seems to me that the power of the lobby to reach young people, college campus is a representative of that population, is at best fraying, right? So that yes, they can impose massive repression. Yes, we have riot police on our campuses. Yes, even our academic freedom is being imperiled, as you know it is across the board. All of which can be read as signs of the power of the lobby. But they also suggest that the lobby is working 24/7 overtime. Just try, like the Dutch boy, putting fingers in the holes in the cracking dike to keep it plugged in. How long do you think it can sustain that? How long do you think it can sustain this level of sweaty, feverish overtime, trying to put out one hole, one crack after another? Or do you think at some point, especially if American power declines, globally speaking, because of all the factors that people have often talked about, the eventual de-dollarization and all these other kinds of pressures that are also on the U.S., how long do you think, I mean, how sustainable is this enterprise, if especially insofar as it depends on a massive regime of suppression that we see on our campuses here in the US, which in my experience on American college campuses is unprecedented. Well, I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think what's happened on university campuses or college campuses is unbelievable. It's not just unprecedented, it's unbelievable. Here you have students who are out protesting a genocide in Gaza. And the lobby goes into overdrive to convince the American public that these are all a bunch of anti-Semites who support Hamas and want to destroy the Jewish state. It's just kind of hard to believe that this has happened. And in terms of civil liberties, one can argue, I would argue, that the greatest threat to civil liberties in the United States at this point in time, when you talk about things like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, are Israel's supporters. I find it hard to believe that I'm making that argument. I grew up in New York City, and I identified Jews as liberals who were the staunchest supporters of civil liberties on the planet when I was young. And what's happening here is because of Israel, not all Jews by any means, but many Jews are being pushed into a position where they're threatening civil liberties, things like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. This is an absolutely horrible situation, especially for American Jews who have flourished in liberal societies, both in Europe and the United States. And it would certainly not be to their advantage or your advantage or my advantage to see liberal America's basic values undermined. It makes me sick to my stomach to see what's going on and to listen to the discourse in the media about what's happening on college campuses. Oh my God. I've been in academia for 43 years now. I should say I've been at the University of Chicago for 43 years. Before that, I was a postdoc for 2 years at Harvard. And I was a graduate student at Cornell University for 5 years, where I got my PhD. In all that time, I have seen almost zero evidence of anti-Semitism, almost zero evidence of anti-Semitism over all those years. Before October 7th, nobody I knew was talking about anti-Semitism on college campuses. Not a serious subject of discourse. All of a sudden, after October 7th, college and university campuses have turned into hotbeds of anti-Semitism. This is ridiculous. And furthermore, if you look at many of the protests, places like Columbia, places like Chicago, places like UCLA, a lot of the students were Jewish, a lot of the students who were protesting. So anti-Semitism, are we serious? But of course, anti-Semitism has now been defined as criticism of Israel. So if any of us offer any criticism of Israel, we're labeled an anti-Semite. Again, this is ludicrous, and it's not just ludicrous, it's dangerous, right? And that's where we are. Now, your question, the big question you ask, is whether or not there's any hope for change. Is the lobby really running around putting its finger in the dike, and at some point it's not going to have enough fingers to put in all the holes? That's your question. I have no good answer to that. Some days I think that the tide is going to turn, and probably sooner rather than later. The lobby just can't sustain this. Other days I think they'll just go on and on and on. If you look at where the lobby was on October 7th and where they are today, they are, I believe, more effective at the policy level today than they were on October 7th. And one could argue that moving forward, they will get even stronger, if that's possible, or at least stay as strong as they are. And but at the same time, you were getting at this, you look at what's happening in terms of the discourse in this country. You look at what's happening around the world. It's hard to believe that this is sustainable over the long term. And I'll take one more cut at this to just sort of give you another angle that I often think about. I think if you look at Greater Israel, the Israelis have four choices. The first two are off the table. One is a truly democratic Greater Israel, which would not be a Jewish state for long. would be a Palestinian state. So that's not going to happen. Second alternative is a two-state solution. That ship has sailed. Two-state solution is not viable. So the two alternative worlds are apartheid or ethnic cleansing. And I believe that Israeli policymakers and Israeli elites fully understand that the choice before them is between apartheid and ethnic cleansing. And they understand, they would never admit this, that Israel is an apartheid state, as B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International have all documented in very comprehensive and sophisticated reports. This is an apartheid state. And I believe Israelis understand what happened to South Africa, right? This is not sustainable over the long term, right? You can't remain like South Africa, and indeed worse than South Africa, as many South African Jews have pointed out. But anyway, therefore, the alternative is ethnic cleansing. And what the Israelis have been desperately trying to do since October 7th is cleanse Gaza and even begin to seriously cleanse the West Bank, because they believe that the only way they can solve the problems they face to get away from apartheid is to cleanse. And if they can't cleanse, maybe murder huge numbers of Palestinians. And if you look at what's happening in Gaza, one could argue that they have been unable to cleanse. They have cleansed northern Gaza, as you say, but they have not cleansed all of Gaza. There's no evidence at this point in time that they're going to be able to push the Palestinians out, either of Gaza or the West Bank. And then you start worrying that what they're going to do is end up murdering hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million or so Palestinians.